Good morning. It's Pop again, Dennis Murray, and today is Popcast 85. It's called Nature's Wisdom, Part 35. And I've gotten some of my mojo back. I feel like, some balance has returned. I'm still reading The True Believer by Eric Hoffer, and I'm reading the book called Hatred by Willard Galen. But I also found some grounds of ways of looking at things in distinction to points they're making that help clarify my, basic notion that the gift of each other is the response to those two books, to the response to the things about us that those two books are pointing out. Not denying what they're saying about us, but affirming that there's something else about us that puts different powerful things at work in our psychology that give us what we need to deal with these fears and anxieties, senses of misery and actual miseries that these books are talking about. Um, and I had a let me just clear out one preliminary matter first. The other day I mentioned about in the Crusades, the first crusade was begun by a call for it by the Pope at the time. And he ended with a Latin phrase, and I didn't have it correctly, wasn't sure of it, so I looked it up. And the phrase was Deus vult, Deus, of course, and vult. And the best translation is God wills it. Um, However, it turns out that this speech was given at the end of an important religious gathering that was both religious figures and political figures, because at the time the church was very active in politics as well as religion. And there, of course, is no text of the speech, no newspaper reports of it with precise quotes. There were a number of people who wrote versions of it. Only one of them was present and wrote his version pretty quickly. And that doesn't include this phrase. But the one that's, become popular among historians, including my favorite historian, Father Hugh, from where I went to high school, is reported by somebody called Robert the monk, and it ends with this Deus vult, and apparently that did become sort of a battle cry, and stirred the masses, and in quick order, a large army was put together and sent to the Crusades. So I just felt like I needed to clear that up. I was being somewhat disrespectful towards an important quote, and I think Father Hugh would have expected me to have the damn thing straight in my mind. So, um, and I love that man. So there we have it. Now, another interesting thing. At the beginning of a book, there's often a quote from somebody. That quote is technically referred to as a preface. And if it's a quote from somebody else, not the author. And so I mentioned to you, I believe, that Stephen Batchelor, whose book Living with the Devil I talked about 4 or 5 podcasts ago, talked about just a little, and whose book we'll talk about more later, not today, in coming days, that Batchelor began his book with a preface of a quote from Blaise Pascal, the French mathematician from the 17th century. And uh, his quote was essentially, I read it to you a week or two ago, so I'm not going to read the whole thing again. But he said, I don't know who put me in the world, nor what the world is, nor what I am myself. And he goes on for a number of pages. I'm in a terrible ignorance about everything. My body, why I'm here instead of there, why me instead of somebody else, etc. I see only infinity on every side, enclosing me like an atom or a shadow that vanishes in an instant. So, in this particular quote from Pascal, he's creating, essentially, he's acknowledging confusion and upset and complete lack of knowledge of his situation vis-a-vis the universe. Um, Now, by interesting coincidence, Hoffer in The True Believer has also a quote from Pascal as his preface. And his is quite different. And I'm going to read it today. Man would fain be great and sees that he is little, would fain be happy and sees that he is miserable. I don't want to appear to be condescending, but the word feign is absolutely outside of most people's, ordinary experience. It means would want. So man would want to be great and sees he is little, would fain be happy and sees that he is miserable, would fain be perfect and sees that he is full of imperfections, would fain be the object of the love and esteem of men, and sees that his faults merit only their aversion and contempt. The embarrassment wherein he finds himself produces in him the most unjust and criminal passions imaginable, for he conceives a mortal hatred against that truth which blames him and convinces him of his faults. Now, wow, this is a very different feeling, a very different concept. But I think it's because the two books that chose these two quotes are trying to do different things. Batchelor is a very well renowned Buddhist uh, who is attempting to give us grounding in a view of the world that achieves much uh, by lessening our sense of self to the point where it eventually disappears. Uh, and then we become very happy in some kind of oneness. Um, we could talk at length about that. And it's difficult for us Westerners to appreciate that idea as a legitimate approach because we're so connected to our sense of self and to the individual. Um, but I'm going to venture in general on this subject, which I'm going to leave quickly, that you remember the point I made a lot in recent days that nature's wisdom includes contradictions, contraries. The diversity of points of view is as much a part of nature's wisdom as the use of a variety of types of animals. And um, the the point being that there are several approaches to the whole concept of, what does the universe call for me? What's in store for me? What's the point of all of this? And one of them is, well, the Buddhist point that the source of all unhappiness is your insistence on keeping an ego self, and if you let go of the ego, you become one with a great oneness, and much of the pain and misery, all of the pain and misery of your life goes away. Um, but so bear in mind in that, so we're respectful of nature's wisdom in having very contrary and contradictory approaches to key problems. But bear in mind in that was the starting point for Buddhism, for Gautama Buddha, was um, avoiding misery and unhappiness. And he felt somewhat like Pascal that misery and unhappiness is the condition of life. And it's funny because Pascal's famous book, Pensees, is where Eric Hoffer gets his quote, and so does Batchelor from the same book. Um, but the real thrust of the book is more what Hoffer has, that life is pretty miserable. And so this matters to us because we're trying to figure out how you respond to people whose intellect has grown to arrogance and whose, anger, fears have grown to hate. And part of that is appreciating ourselves in our present circumstances. And part of that is appreciating various ideas about ourselves. And it turns out that some important ideas are found in these several books that about mass movements and hatred that we've been looking at, but also in some other books that we've been looking at. And so we start to try and piece together a fair picture of ourselves and always work it in terms of what I think is nature's wisdom, a new view of nature's wisdom that seems to be called for in our present circumstances of the Great Divide. We need to seem to find some new appreciation of nature's wisdom to help us get out of this mess. And so for me, that means that all of this emphasis on happiness and misery that Pascal is talking about, and that Galen is talking about in hatred, and Hoffer is talking about in the True Believer. It seems to me that it's the wrong emphasis. That happiness and misery seem byproducts of life, and focusing on gaining happiness and avoiding misery seems unwise. It seems best to live yourself in relation to others, which seems to be how we're called to live, and trust that that call comes from a universe that's characterized by some kind of creative goodness. So there's two reasons that would make you not trust that. And one would be that you can't see that there's an inherent goodness in the universe that has death in it and hate in it and necessity in it and unfairness in it. But I've attempted to explain at the beginning of my podcasts that I think there's more than enough evidence to see those things as part of our gifts instead of curses. And I won't repeat all that because I've done that many times. Um, and additionally, one of the you can trust the inherent goodness of the universe in spite of the evil that men do. And people are okay. I'm going to go back and phrase that. One of the challenges to why you would trust the universe is the evil that men do. If the universe is marked by some kind of a creative goodness, then why aren't people marked by that same creative goodness? And we can see that lots of people engage in evil and as a sort of their first choice in life, and it seems like they live their life that way. And there's lots of people who otherwise are good enough, uh, not beyond, hope on our part, who sometimes fall into evil. And but my point of view is, again, as part of the beginning of the podcasts, I laid this out as well. My point of view is that there's ample evidence that that's a necessary circumstance of free will. If we are to have, as we seem to, the moral quality of our choices to our credit or blame, then some of us have to make poor choices. Some of us have to choose against being a gift to each other. Some of us have to choose against trusting the sacredness that we feel inside us, the awe and the sense that there's a creative goodness in the universe. Some of us have to not see those things, turn away from those things on occasion or fundamentally, because otherwise there's no free will. And we very much want free will because we want our own life to have the meaning that our choices involve. Now, this is another part of what Hoffer is talking about, that there's a lot of people that feel crushed by free will because they feel crushed about having to be responsible for the choices they make. And part of the anger that gets swells up into these giant explosions of mass movements like fascism and Nazism and the Soviet form of communism is that people are desperately trying to escape from the freedom of having a free choice because they feel that, as Pascal described it here, that they are really making bad choices. Their freedom is a crushing burden, and they can't live with the responsibility of their failures. And again, I want to, all of these things that we're talking about, I'm going to continually try to bring them back home, to put them on the framework of this new view of nature's wisdom that I hope I'm presenting cogently. And all of these discussions from various books and points of view and experiences are ways to bring light onto what it actually means to have this new view of nature's wisdom. So I really don't agree that Pascal's description of people or Hoffer's description of a characteristic of a lot of people is a fair description. In this sense, the implication is that people are miserable because they perceive themselves as being fundamentally, sinful. They've made bad choices, and they feel that they would not have a good reputation, that they don't deserve, a good reputation. And if they have a bad one, it makes them miserable. If people haven't yet caught on to them, still they feel horrible inside and fear the day when people do catch on to them and hate them. So what I think is that condition is because there's a lack of appreciation of the social side of our species, the sociality that all of us need. Because we do live in a world in which we can see and are very upset by death, hate, necessity, and unfairness. And we just can't live adequately in the face of those things by ourselves. We only evolved the capacity to be aware of those things after we evolved the capacity to be deeply connected to each other. So that in the last, some thousands of years, with our discovery of our intellect and our individuality, we've worshiped those two things to the point where we've lost adequate appreciation of our sociality. And to me, I'm going to continue exploring what Hoffer has to say and what Galen has to say in coming days. in detail because they're very useful for the conversation. But to me, the conversation is always about what they're saying is a description of people who have not uh, who are not appreciating the sociality that is part of our birthright and part of our condition as we face the world. So, in the quote from Batchelor, where he said he can't figure out his place in the world, well, I would suggest that nature's wisdom tells him that if he turns to those around him, he'll find comfort from that insecurity. And when he says he wishes that he were great and sees he's little, he wishes he were happy and sees he's miserable, he wishes he was perfect and sees he's imperfect, he wishes he was held in great esteem and see he only has faults that merit aversion and contempt. The it's true we all have faults, and we all do sometimes, nearly despair of our own integrity and of our own worth as a person. Um, there's a reason for the religious concept of sin. It's a good description of an emotional sense we have about ourselves for things where we have failed to live the gift of each other. We have failed to live up to the best of our humanity. And I'm not saying these things don't occur to us. I'm saying the remedy for this fellow is not to go join a mass movement or to live in misery, uh, but to turn to those around him. The gift of each other is both something you give others and something you take from others. And these people all are describing a situation where you need to take. You're desperate and you need some extra stuff brought your way. So turn to your friends and neighbors and ask for it, and it's there to be received. Okay, so that's enough for today. Uh, there's always more, and one hopes we have tomorrow. Okay, take care. Bye bye.